We have conflict in the Middle East. Climate change has finally been accepted, not necessarily universally, but as, dare I say it, an existential threat. There is great power competition afoot. The line between economics and national security has been blurred. Governments are starting to look about resilient supply chains, developing policies, intervening in markets, and these are having a number of different impacts. One of the big challenges here remains that it's not just about global competition. The race in terms of securing sustainable, resilient supply chains of critical minerals and critical energy transition technologies, that race is one of diversification. It's very clear that when we have a concentration of markets where 80, 90, and in some cases the high 90 percentiles of certain markets are concentrated geographically, in a time of climate change and in a time of great power competition, that creates systemic weaknesses. Also today, we heard Senator Wong, the Australian Foreign Minister, make a very clear statement around action. And certainly this panel here are moving beyond that high-level statements to the actual enabling and action of how we move to this brighter green transition. With that in mind, you didn't come here to see me. You came here to listen to our outstanding panel. And I'd like to introduce, and I'll ask for their forgiveness for not going through their extensive biographies online here. I did actually go to that attempt, and I figured that it'll take me about 15 minutes to do justice to all of them, so I have my deepest apologies. So I welcome the Honourable Madeleine King, MP, the Minister for Resources and Northern Australia, His Excellency Linopo Jem Tshering, the Minister of Energy and National Resources, the Royal Government of Bhutan, Tadashi Maeda, the Chairman of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, and Ms. Mannat Jaspal, the Director and Fellow for Climate and Energy at the ORF in the Middle East. With all that said in mind, let's move and get as many questions that we can in today. So I'm going to take the prerogative here and lead off as a member of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Minister King, lots of government policies, lots of discussions about future made in Australia. Can you elaborate on the Australian government's strategic priorities in terms of supporting the green transition and particularly regarding critical mineral supply?
Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone that's here today, to the fellow panellists as well. So the government's strategic priorities is, as you know, around our policies is a future made in Australia, but an important part of that is Australia stepping up to take a leadership role in the development of critical minerals and rare earths industries globally. It's an important thing that we do this well and do it properly while we do make sure we have a sustainable, I call them like new resources, I suppose, in Australia. As everyone here would be well aware, our economy is built on the export of traditional resources, so coal, iron ore, gold, of course, too, but also LNG as a really important energy source for the region. But critical minerals and rare earths are our new economy, I suppose. And I might add, I don't think they'll ever supplant the magnitude of those other resources I just mentioned. But given the geological gift that we have in Australia, of the very old continent, making use of those minerals for the benefit of our partners, our friends, industries right around the world, in that transition is vitally important. But we do have to step up, and that's why we've prioritised incentives such as the production tax credit incentive for critical minerals, which is the $17 billion plus package, as well as the low risk loans that we're providing through the Critical Minerals Facility and Export Finance Australia, and also my Northern Australia portfolio, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility. So our priorities are to make a new industry in an area that is heavily stressed by the dominance of particular players in this market that make it difficult to compete and will need government support.
Look, thanks, Minister. You know, there can be no doubt that Australia and Australians is one of the great, and I know there's most likely Canadians in the room, so I'll be kind about this. You know, the two greatest mining countries in the world are Australia and Canada, both at home here in Australia and globally. However, creating alternative supply chains really is, as a miner recently told me, a CEO, based on capital and access to capital. And with that in mind, Mr. Maeda, how is the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation adapting its finance strategies to support green initiatives in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Moderator. For Japan, that first wake-up call, we are aware of this importance of criticality of mineral resources happened in 2010 when Chinese fishermen's boat embedded into our territorial water of the south of Okinawa Prefecture, Senkaku Island. Then we arrested the captain of a fisherman boat. And then several days later, China put a ban on rare earth element, they export to Japan. We filed appeal to the WTO panel. However, that WTO did not make any sense. Therefore, that we need to understand that how important critical mineral supply chain issues are. Therefore, that's now, most recently, as you know, that G7 already created a 5-point plan of security of mineral resources, but has been expanded to that mineral security partnership, not just only the G7, but also that Australia, Korea, and the 3 countries from Nordic states also involved. So it's a more multi-layered approach, and also that it's a very important because of the multi-layered also that among the like-minded countries to secure that all supply chain of critical minerals. When the critical minerals importance is increased because of carbon neutrality agenda, and the cobalt, the lithium, even the copper, in addition to the rare earth element, that is more scarce, and also that many processing pieces now occupied by only one country, which is China. This is very vulnerable. Therefore, that Japan will step up, and also together with our partners, like-minded countries, we are ready to make some financial support to cover this together with other financial institution of DFI, like the EFA and USDFC, others. So that's now this partnership just started, and we're going to expand this partnership.
Thank you, Mr. Maeda, and there can be no doubt that Japan has really demonstrated that this issue isn't necessarily about bifurcation. I picked up very clearly in what you said then, which is we're creating alternative, competitive, resilient supply chains and not bifurcating trade in that way. Lots said in the region, of course, and globally about the great mining countries, the consumer countries, but the Indo-Pacific is made up of very many voices. And so I guess, Minister Tshering, what are Bhutan's key priorities in terms of transitioning to renewable energy? And how do these align with broader regional goals?
Thank you very much. I take this opportunity to thank Government of Australia as well as India for organizing this and inviting us to this forum also. So I thank you for that one on behalf of my government and the King. So I thank you very much. In regards to now, as it is Bhutan, so far I think everyone knows that we are rich into hydropower, and then we have been harnessing the hydropower system right from the beginning. So it was now today that of the 33,500 hydro reserve that we have, so we have just harnessed 2,500 only. But I think of late people are talking high of global that climate changes. So that's a main issue that we now look into from hydro to renewable energy. So in this regard, we have also got into now in solar, then wind, and of course any other new energies that we are looking into. So this is what we are processing into. Yes.
Thank you, Minister. And there can be no doubt with that, though, the supply chains we're talking about today, the critical minerals and rare earths that are mined across Australia, are the sorts of inputs that go into allowing that energy transition. Let's change step for a while. And let's go back to where I started for the day. Mr. Jaspal, how do we assess the geopolitical implications of the green transition for this region?
Thanks, Sean, for your question. I think before I answer your very specific question, I think it's important to emphasize the very diversity within the Indo-Pacific region when it comes to climate and energy. By that I mean, in terms of per capita emissions. So within the Indo-Pacific bloc itself, we have countries which are very industrialized and have per capita emissions which are way above the global average. We also have countries which are low income, which have very low per capita emissions, and we also have Pacific Island nations and the SIDS, which have, in my opinion, negative emissions because their biodiversity conservation efforts aren't always accounted for. So there is that massive diversity that we need to think in account, and basis that, the priorities, timelines, and energy transition agendas and goals would vary. And naturally, the implications of the political and the economic dynamic. Second, I would say diversity in terms of natural endowment, capacities and capabilities. For example, Australia is very rich in many critical minerals like lithium, and because of its massive land availability, renewables is the most possibly low-cost option for a net zero future. But if you were to take the case of India, for example, despite a very massive renewable push, nuclear could actually be a very crucial part of the energy mix, as also emphasized by our finance minister this year, because which would really help us meet a massive and rising energy demand. So I think it's important to note the dynamic and the capabilities and the natural endowments of the nations, which will then certainly determine the kind of response they will have to external as well as internal energy pressures. I think more broadly on geopolitical trends, I think we're seeing a couple of patterns emerging. If I were to just maybe highlight about really quickly 4 to 5 in the interest of time, there is a shift in energy dependencies. Most countries in the Indo-Pacific region were very reliant on fossil fuels, but there is a very strategic and a mindful choice for transitioning towards cleaner energy sources, which will have implications on, on energy security, for example, and national security as well. Second would be, I think, the competition for critical minerals. And here I want to bring out an analogy that, if you were to consider the oil and gas sector, Saudi Arabia, for example, provides about is one of the largest oil suppliers in the world, and I think it provides close to about 15% of the global oil supply. Now just compare that with the critical mineral ecosystem. We have Australia providing close to 50% of lithium. We have 50% of nickel coming from Indonesia, 70% of rare earths from China, 50% of cobalt from Congo, and I think about 90% of the processing happens in China. So that kind of concentration of critical minerals is way more massive and way more extreme than it was ever in the oil and gas period and era. So I think the monopolization of those critical mineral supply chains will be also something that we'll have to be very cautiously handling. So I think there is something that we need to learn there. And also, as Chairman Maeda said, the example he gave of China cutting supplies to Japan of rare earths, and I think back in 2010 is a very befitting example, and it's something that we all need to take lessons from. I think also the third bit would be around BRI. I think when we speak of climate finance, and a lot is said on this, but about 80% of the climate finance that is raised in the OECD countries is invested back in OECD countries. So clearly there is a massive absence of capital, the form of capital, but also the scale of capital for Global South countries. And China is clearly through its BRI investments, which is steering towards green investments a lot now, is taking advantage of that kind of gap, right? So I think that's again something that we need to be cautious of going forward. And there is a lot many smaller regional economies, and I think the Solomon Islands is a very classic example that we take here, which could be a compelling reminder of being able to balance those dynamics there. I think fourthly, it's important to talk about trade shifts. Penny Wong, Minister Penny Wong spoke about creating, I think, predictability in trading arrangements. I think she mentioned that term, and I think that's extremely important to look at because with shift to cleaner energy sources, countries that invest in clean energy will certainly have a comparative advantage. Say countries that invest in hydrogen will have favorable trading opportunities open up for them. But at the same time, there are policies out there that can be perhaps not always very favorable. For example, when we talk about CBAM, I mean, in ways CBAM is in ways considered sort of, a trade protectionist policy, which in many ways, right? So, we need to sort of really assess the implications of such policies to be able to ensure that it doesn't exacerbate inequalities in the Indo-Pacific countries. Also IRA, we have IRA, and there's been a rise of domestic industrial policies out there, and which will trigger other such domestic policies to come about. And I think the future Made in Australia, which is very similar and is sort of in a way a response to the IRA as well, right? So I think there will be certainly a lot of trade shifts, and there is tremendous scope and potential for climate diplomacy. And I think lastly, I just want to maybe in the interest of time briefly touch upon migration. There will be massive climate change induced migration in the Indo-Pacific region, which again, which will have massive economic but also social and political implications. And I think needs to be weighed in when we discuss this subject.
Look, thank you very much. And I think some of the points in there really resonate, and they run, through various dialogues. There can be no doubt. In my last 10 years in a think tank, the last 2 years, there's barely a week goes by, or nary a week goes by, where we're not contacted and working with an Indian think tank or talking to Indian officials around, how to increase that awareness of the Indian market, the Indian collaboration. I think that pursuit of capital. And JBIC will no doubt have that same perspective. I know Minister King will, because we've heard from industry. And I think the other part is that concentration. There was a 2022 report done by our Australian Productivity Commission, which really looked at supply chain risks, and it really highlighted where you have that geographical concentration. It's not just about geopolitics. It is really about that increases a high level of risk. We've talked across the board here about both earlier today and that during that each of your contributions about cooperation. Now, Minister King, what role do you see Australia playing in the international partnerships to enhance sustainable resource management in the Indo-Pacific? And may you, I guess it might be worth highlighting, this case example, which is the MSP, which has been called the NATO of minerals. Is that the case?
I'll get back to that one. What is our role in these international networks? Well, primarily a leadership role, of course, and that is firstly because we have these resources under the ground right across this country from west to east, north to south. So, we have, as I said in my earlier answer, a responsibility to be part of the development of these networks. How we and you mentioned Canada, John, as well, two strong mining countries that are very proud, quite rightly, of their high standards, environmental standards, governance standards, and also, of course, really importantly, high worker safety standards and good worker conditions. So that means our products cost more, as mining companies would be really pleased to tell you any time. But that's a good thing because we want people to support the industry and we want them to support it in more places around the world too. So whilst Australia and Canada with a very strong shared democratic values and systems, high worker standards, environmental standards, we also want to see others lift to have those standards as well. Which will be a change for some places, but equally we should all aspire to have very good environmental practices, worker safety practices. So within the IPEF, the Minerals Security Partnership that you mentioned, that is what we continually are talking about, and I think that's a good thing for a country like Australia with its extraordinary history of mining, and it's something we've done ever since. Our First Nations people, mined copper for the colour of it, and they traded in it right across the country, and then after European settlement, of course, coal was our first export. So we have a long-established mining industry. Today, obviously, it employs hundreds of thousands of people and is literally the backbone of the economy. So it will remain the case, but we have a lot to learn from others, but equally we can help others do things better. And so that reflecting that ESG standards in pricing is going to be a challenge because we know we'll need these minerals for the things we need to transition all sorts of economies, whether they're economies such as Japan, which does, increasingly making use of nuclear, but does rely on fossil fuels, as does we, how they transition to other sources. For Korea as well, Bhutan is clearly working on, as its hydropower, so it's in a different situation. And I think it was mentioned before, we do need to think about comparative advantages and what each jurisdiction has to offer in that power transition, the energy transition. But Australia will take a leadership role in making sure those standards are high and at some point, and this will be a difficult thing to do when the prices of the extraction and processing of those minerals are reflected in the international market, because right now they're not, and that's why we have large mining enterprises failing in this country, because pricing has just got out of control on the international market because of the dominance and manipulation of that market by other actors.
Thanks, Minister. I guess picking up on that, Australia has actually, and its miners have actually been, for multiple decades, the setters of ESG standards. And part of this isn't just about government intervention, but in terms of that pricing component either, which is consumers, despite overall the commitment and understanding of climate change. And I often say if we got 100 people into a room and asked them to buy a lithium battery, how many would actually look where the lithium was mined or whether it was mined in an ESG compliant way? So there is a significant amount of market work there in terms of the consumer end. And in all of this, there's so much talk over the last several years about private-public partnerships. And I guess we're here. Mr. Maeda, can you discuss the importance of public-private partnerships in funding the green transition? And I guess most importantly, how they can be effectively leveraged from theory to actual practice?
Well, this is, you're absolutely right that the more importance of the kind of restructuring the financial framework by means of the PPP, public-private partnership, is very critical. So, for example, in the case of some critical minerals, for example, the cobalt, they heavily dependent on that country like DRC, Congo. So the political risk is very high. So normally the commercial, the private company is not able to do by themselves. So the government can make some of support to mitigate those political risks. And also that because of a carbon neutrality agenda, the conventional commercial bank is more and more reluctant to provide any financing to the fossil fuel and others. Therefore, that now this very substantial kind of movement is now going on. Therefore, we may have to be more flexible enough to accommodate those reality. So that's very key. And so therefore, that, for example, in case of JBIC, my bank is not only the debt financing. We are now expanding that capability of equity investment, and also that we are taking a more risk, and also by mitigating risk, so that we have a two operation account. One account is the special operation account to enable us to take more risk. For example, that we are going to support the startup. The startups, many early stage startups do not have any cash flow. Therefore, it's such a risk. There's a different type of risk, but we analyze very carefully but deeply that the feature of the risk and how to accommodate this capability of risk mitigation to be a critical part of the PPP. And also that government itself can give some incentive like tax credit, for example. That's a future made in Australia also has some component of tax credit. So that is very good. So that this is a new form of cooperation, of a partnership between private sector and government, and more broader that role of DFI like us, and also that multinational like World Bank and so on. So that we need to do everything we can do to formulate a new, more practical and more a better shape and the platform of PPP.
Thank you, and I guess 2 points that really resonate again, which is this issue of capital, the issue of the market being able to hedge geopolitical risk and market manipulation, and how that impacts on investments. The other one is, I guess, a more positive note, and quite often when we're talking about critical minerals today and we're talking about the green transition, I guess it's not part of the green transition exactly, but it does illustrate how two great countries can work together to create an alternative supply chain. Now, it's near and dear to my heart, the Itchy's complex, or INPEX Itchy's complex in the NT, the Northern Territory, watching and sitting on the harbour there, watching 20% of energy, LNG energy resilience coming from Australia to Japan. And a truly inspirational project in the sense that had we had the discussions, say, 20 years ago, people would say it was never possible. So there is hope in this situation. So the cynic in me as an old intelligence person is listening to this and seeing that there is these avenues for real partnerships. Again, I want to just slightly change lines because we've talked about the geopolitics, we've talked about miners, we've talked about the economics. But Minister Tshering, what we haven't done is we haven't talked about communities and I guess an inclusiveness. And this point I'd like to say is, how is your ministry ensuring that the energy transition and that route or that journey you're going along actually is inclusive and involves communities?
Thank you very much. First and foremost, let me also inform here that in Bhutan, we have something called GNH. So that's gross national happiness. So by virtue of that one, whatever the plans and policies, it's driven by that national happiness concept. Because here, the gross national happiness, by virtue of that one, number one, we say that, okay, like preserve your culture. And number two, this is that your environment should be protected. And then accordingly, that moves into that, okay, sustainable development. Yes, while you can develop, but then it should be sustainable. Yes, that should be the concept of it. And of course, there should be that good governance by that one. So in that philosophy, when we move into, so hydropower, as I said that we are very rich into hydro reserve, and then we have also, and we are harnessing that one. But then as for today's trend of global warming, climate changes and other things, so we also look into the other sources like solar, wind, and then natural resources. So in this regard, myself, now particularly as a ministry concerned, Minister for Energy and Natural Resources. So in this regard, now in energy, so whatever generations and other things, energy concerned, that's there, but then on the natural resource concern also. So now we have to get into that mining concept, then even the forestry, then other things. So which byproducts, and then looking forward for the green energy, so that we are now getting into a renewable energy master plan, which is we set recently, government has approved a master plan for 2040. So in this regard, what we are planning is we look forward that, okay, like not only on the hydro, but then while hydro should not be dropped as the backbone of the country, so now we get into the natural resource concern. So whereby we look into the green energy. And of course, whatever, while we say that as a small country, we generate a lot, whatever it may be, but that's in the summer. Because the system is, we have lots of generation during the summertime, but then that will be exported to India. But whereas, vice versa, during the winter with the domestic load. And then the two countries, India and Bhutan, we live in such a harmony that India requires maximum power during the summertime due to heat and other things, whereas Bhutan requires power during the winter time. So winter load goes into very high, thereby we import from India. So this vice versa, that's happening. But then, however, in the long run, so that's we are planning for 2040. So we expect that at least by 2040, we will be generating 20,000 megawatts. So which I think self-sufficient for the country, as well as will be exporting to India also. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. And I look, you know, in Australia, and this is part of that common thing. So Bhutan may be a small country. You know, right now, Australian entrepreneurs are looking at how we can supply solar power to Singapore. Secondly, is that common interest. As I was saying earlier, you know, Australian miners have been the scene setters, the standard setters on ESG because they understand that. The market hasn't always responded to that in terms of pricing yet, but certainly that need for global standards. So from components or from mining all the way through the whole supply chain has the highest of ESG standards. Now, everyone has had a hard question today, and I didn't stay to Ms. Jaspal earlier, but I think that this next one is probably one of those really tough questions to answer, which is what strategies should countries in the Indo-Pacific adopt to navigate potential tensions arising from competition over critical minerals?
You've clearly saved the best for the last, but I think we've spoken about this, right? And my colleagues here on the panel also have discussed about the importance of diversifying the critical mineral supply chain. When we talk of this diversification, we need to look at geographical diversification. So to ensure that we don't rely on one country entirely. I think there is a lot of scope to, between government to government, but also government to private and private to private sort of collaboration between countries and between jurisdictions within the Indo-Pacific region. So joint ventures and direct investments. As an example, we have something called as the Kabul in India, which is sort of a joint venture between three central public sector enterprises within the Ministry of Mines, which looks at, mining lithium and cobalt to start with, and has engaged with G2G partnerships with Australia and countries in Latin America, including Argentina. So that's a classic example of ensuring joint ventures and partnership between countries and between private sectors and between governments as well. I think also, thirdly, we need to start ensuring that we build more strategic reserves for critical minerals, very similar to how we had for petroleum reserves. I think countries need to start having reserves for critical minerals to be able to ensure that we have enough supply during emergencies and as well. I think secondly, it's so important to pursue technologies in that use alternate materials. So R&D in substitute becomes very critical. For example, the sodium-ion batteries or zinc-based batteries. There's also a lot of, even when we speak of storage solutions, there is a lot of scope in thermal storage or hydrogen fuel cells. So there are a lot of technologies that exist right now, but we need to look at alternative sources and alternative materials materials so that we reduce our dependencies on scarce critical minerals that at this point we currently face. And I think thirdly, Minister King spoke about harmonization of regulations and policies. I think till the time we don't ensure that the language of policies and regulation and finance is uniform across jurisdictions, there is interoperability and harmonization in these policies, it'll be very difficult for us to cooperate. We'll continue to compete with each other, right? So to be able to cooperate, we need to ensure our language is more common and is more harmonized. So I think regulations and policies need to be more aligned, and G20 and BRICS and a lot of these other minilaterals sort of provide a great framework to be able to come together. We have the ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific, and so I think that's that. And I think also within, we've spoken about the bilateral and multilateral trade agreements within the Indo-Pacific. There is a lot of scope to ensure that the trade deals have critical mineral components, and that's an important part of those trade agreements as well. And also capacity building. There is a lot of, I think Minister Jaishankar spoke about this in the last panel, that there is a lot of scope on education and capacity building because there is a lot of diversity in terms of knowledge and disparity in terms of understanding and capacities within the Indo-Pacific as well. So I think capacity building, knowledge transfer, tech code development are important aspects which can be included part of the trade agreements and trade deals and the multilateral agreements that we agree on in the Indo-Pacific region.
Look, as always, there's a magic moment when we've got a report very shortly that'll go out, and before we came on, you turned around and mentioned harmonising policies, and I thought I'd sit there and go, tick, yep, we've got that one covered. And I guess this is one of those issues, the market itself, and picking up one of the things that creates the instability here at the moment. And without talking about how these things started, but there can be no doubt that multiple government policies are changing market forces as they are put in it. They're not harmonised, be they the Inflation Reduction Act, be they other acts. They do or can potentially have a destabilising impact. There's always two parts of this too as well. I picked up there is the national resilience and then there's the market resilience. And I think stockpiling can serve both purposes in the sense that stockpiling can create a national resilience. Minilateral stockpiling, whether it be virtual or real, can create market resilience and demand that stabilises prices as well. So look, it's fantastic at that point. Again, I'm looking at the time before anyone reaches out and grabs me off the stage, so I've got one more question. Again, this one is, we're talked, so Mr. Jaspal has gone through and talked about balancing and how we do this at that global level. Minister King, I'm going to ask you the final question for the day, which is, how do you balance off all these things in terms of Australia? So, how do we balance off the environmental, First Nations issues, community issues, the green transition and the mining process that goes into it? And I know the short answer is it's really hard. But this panel did say action. So I was wondering if you might be able to highlight some of the policy approaches to that.
Well, not only is that balance really hard, it is also absolutely essential. You cannot do the mining we want to be able to do, all the processing, without making sure they balance. And sometimes I guess they won't always balance perfectly, but nonetheless we seek to make it work. And the problem is when you don't have those standards and you don't have all these things working together, you lose your community support for mining. And we've seen jurisdictions basically outsource their mining for decades now. The EU being one of them. Trying to get that back is difficult when the community has moved on a little. And fortunately in Australia we have a community that's been supporting mining. It has provided hundreds of thousands of jobs for centuries, so it's a really important part of our history, and it continues to grow, and the traditional resources, I said, are still going strong, and we will build upon that in the critical minerals and rare earths required for the green transition, but equally for strategic defence materials as well. but as soon as you lose community support, everything becomes harder, whether it's financing, whether it's getting permissions, whether it's getting people to work in that industry. So when we talk about the policies, we have to make sure we keep that balance right. Well, obviously we've got our environmental protections and the acts, both in the states, territories and federally. And we're seeking to improve them. We can always do better on our approvals processes, making them more efficient. We have our policies around financing of projects, because we are up against it with very thin markets and challenging international circumstances and competition that is hard. It's hard nut to crack in many circumstances. And then when we see these bans on exports, it's rare earths, but there are more, graphite, gallium, germanium, and there's another one, antimony, I think, maybe, is about, recently. So these are vulnerabilities that we are all exposed to because we don't have that diversification of supply. But not only in the ore and the extraction of that, but the processing, like the really hard bit, and the chemical processing, the turning into oxides for batteries, the precursor materials and so forth. So we have to walk a long way down that processing chain to diversify that particular industry so that we can have alternatives, which we don't have. And I know that's been well talked about here. But so I haven't answered your question. There is a suite of policies, but what I really want to let people be aware of is we just simply have to make them work, and we have to work with our partners around the world to make them work, and improving the practices of others whilst improving our own is really what we're all about.
Look, thank you, Minister. And I've now got the second hardest thing to do for the day in terms of this panel, which is I'm supposed to take all the fantastic content, comments, points, and sum them up into something meaningful that says, hey, it's okay. And I think that there are some common things in this, which is this is an extensive problem that crosses across sectors. It crosses it from R&D and our research sector through to mining. You mentioned processing specifically for critical minerals. In many of these cases, it's not like mining a commodity like iron ore or coal. Some of them hundreds of chemical steps in that process. Their processing varies location to location. Bhutan has showed that they've got a commitment and want a commitment from beginning to end in terms of their green transition. I use the word, the market itself is distorted and might say unfair. Certainly not the forces that allowed 3 decades since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the announcement of the end of history. We've seen great economic growth. We're in a new period of time where resilience is going to become more important. No one here really mentioned it in the sense of that resilience was in terms of protectionism or a hyper-nationalism. It really was a collaborative effort or a team sport. We know that capital and pursuing capital is a significant challenge right along that supply chain. And I think Japan has provided, and as I said, that INPEX example, but not just that, their work with the Australian company Lynas in terms of finding an alternative rare earth supply shows some examples of how that public-private partnership. But as Ms. Jaspal said, I think for me, and it always is, this really is about a mini-lateral effort. It's not about creating all new supply chains. What it's about, and I always like this economic perspective that comes out of Tokyo, it's about a China and model, if I might be so, not a China or model. So what we're trying to do here as a group is create an alternative, resilient supply chain that has the highest levels of ESG compliance. And that is going to involve private-public partnerships and mini-lateral efforts to achieve that. And with that said, I want to, on behalf of ORF, on behalf of ASPI, thank each of you for participating here, and thank you for bearing with me with my questions. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, panel, taking us